Good evening, everyone. My name is Mike Fegon. I'm the senior planner here with the city of Bonita Springs. I've been here for about 10 years now, but I've been in this senior planner position for the last 4. And I'd like to welcome you to this comprehensive plan workshop that we have. This is the second workshop that we've done on this particular topic. This is a process that started well over a year ago in terms of amending the city's comprehensive plan. And when we do that, we essentially put these amendments into 2 buckets. We have state-mandated amendments, which are amendments that we are required to review and try and amend our comp plan for. And then we have a bucket of optional amendments as well. And we're going to be discussing both of those tonight with you. So it's very important that you're here, and we're very happy that you are here. For those of you that have not signed in, there is a sign-in sheet. And if you could please make sure that you sign in before you leave, that would be fantastic. In addition to the public tonight, we do have some board members here from our zoning board and from the local planning agency. And these are 2 advisory boards in the city that are instrumental in the way the city reviews projects and ultimately conducts its business. So we do want to go ahead and give those board members a shout out tonight and recognize them. We do have from the zoning board, the vice chair, Ben Hirschison, is here. And also from the zoning board, we have a board member, Gerald Benson. And with the local planning agency, we have board member Daniel Doogie. And we also have board member Ray Townsend. And we'd like to welcome them here tonight. We also have the mayor of the city of Bonita Springs with us as well, Rick Steinmeier. And again, they are here because they are an important part of the way the city conducts its business when it reviews projects for compliance with the comprehensive plan. It's a big deal overall, but as far as their role tonight, they're here just to listen and observe. And because of Sunshine Law, they're going to be reserving their comments for their time up at the dais. So tonight, they're just here just to listen and observe and hear what's going to be said. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Margaret Banyan to introduce her team and kind of walk you through the presentation tonight with regards to the state-mandated amendments and the optional amendments. And then we're going to do some breakout sessions, and we'll go from there. So, Dr. Banyan?
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. So I have a loud voice, but I think we're live streaming, so I'm going to stay on the microphone. Part of the loud voice came from teaching undergraduates that you have to make sure they stay entertained. So meanwhile, we don't always have microphones in the classroom. But I'd like to introduce some members of the team here. Dr. Roger Green is Florida Gulf Coast University professor, and Victoria Guillard. Victoria. I did. I said it the French way, I believe, right? And they're both here to help with comments. So as many of you may know, I was a professor at Florida Gulf Coast University, but have since moved. So they're your local presence, a very important piece for us, which is to stay connected to the community. So what I plan to do tonight is go through a presentation to give you some context about the comprehensive plan and the amendments and the process that we're going through now. And hopefully be able to leave you with some information and what to kind of pay attention to in the future with the comprehensive plan and with the city's planning process. So it's not a long presentation, and we will have time for comments, and then at the very end we'll bring everybody back together if there's any additional questions. So tonight's agenda, we've done the introductions, we can check that box, presentation, and then input and questions. So pretty straightforward. So I want to talk a little bit about the comprehensive plan itself so that you have a context about what it is we're talking about amending. So the comprehensive plan is required by the state of Florida that cities and counties have a comprehensive plan. And it is the long-range future plan for the city. So in many ways, it describes your how you build some of the density and how many houses that are built per acre. it describes all of the long-range policies, programs, and public investments in the city. So the comprehensive plan has a series of what are called elements, and those elements speak to different portions of the planning process. So you have a future land use element that talks about density and areas in the city, future land use categories in the city, for example. Then you have a transportation element that focuses on transportation and the transportation infrastructure. You have a housing element that focuses on development of housing and housing stock, etc. So that's the comprehensive plan. It's fairly long and also described in terms of goals, objectives, and policies. So goals are very broad, objectives are a little more narrow and measurable, and then there's policies. So you'll see that expressed in the comprehensive plan. So the full plan, I want to just make sure you have a chance to know where you can access the full plan. It's documented in a repository called MuniCode, M-U-N-I code. So the link is there, and if you just type in library.municode.com, then you'll get to all of the comprehensive plans that are with that repository. There's a big map. You can drill down to Florida and then drill down to Bonita Springs. So I encourage you to go look at that so that you have an idea about what the full comprehensive plan looks like. When you go to the site, that's what you'll see when you drill down. You'll also notice that the city's ordinances are also documented there. So it's a good resource and it's kept up to date. So that I encourage you to go look at some point. So let me talk a little bit about the comprehensive plan and its relationship to the other parts of the city's plans. So the comprehensive plan, like I said, is broad and long term. It could be 20, 25, 30, 40 years focus. That's also related to the Land Development Code. So Land Development Code is much more specific. So you'll have specific development regulations that you see in the Land Development Code. So whereas the comprehensive plan may have a policy about the city will develop code for green building, that's policy. It doesn't say specifically what that code is. It doesn't say what that code will determine. So you would then go to the Land Development Code or Land Development Regulations to look at the specifics. So Land Development Code and the Comprehensive Plan are very much related. And then there's a lot of other plans that you'll see in the city that may also relate to the Comprehensive Plan. So for example, the city's strategic plan may identify strategic priorities that are related to the comprehensive plan policies. Those other plans and documents may also look at funding priorities or may look at a much shorter term kind of focus. Say 3 to 5 years is a common strategic plan focus. So that's how these things are related. So many times the Land Development Code, when there's very specific regulations, that's something easy to talk about because you can see the concrete rules and guidelines related to development. Comprehensive plan, much more broad. So I place here in the comprehensive plan, this is one of the important features of the comprehensive plan, which is the future land use map for the city. This future land use map, if you see in, I was taught how to use this pointer. There we go. If you see this legend here, and you can see this in MuniCode. I know it's very small on the screen. But these are all different future land use categories, and these are all reflected in the city's map. So what you'll see is there's different regulations and different uses for these different future land use categories. And that's important to note because some of the work that we had to do in these amendments related to the uses that were allowed in these future land use categories. I'll give you an example. is that some of the residential future land use categories will describe more or less a residential use, homes, and some of those may have higher density. So some may allow for cottage homes or higher density homes. And that's, again, important, and I'll tell you why in a minute with the state required amendments, what we were tasked at looking at. Some of these other future land use categories may be industrial. So I believe industrial's pink over here. This very bright pink would describe industrial uses in those areas. Okay. So for this process, the state also, not only do they require a comprehensive plan, but they require cities and counties to review that comprehensive plan every 7 years. That process is called an EAR or an EAR or Evaluation and Appraisal Review. So that's the 7-year process, and the city's been given a timeline in which it must review its plan. That timeline was up April 1, 2023. So that process is to look at the comprehensive plan and identify if there were changes in state law that would necessitate changes in the city's comprehensive plan. So you'll see what that means in a minute. And so that's one part of the review. The other part of the review is to look to see what's changed in the city. How much has the city been built out? What's the population look like now? So that review is a pretty comprehensive review. That document, at the front page is posted here, but that document is fairly long, 100 plus pages, where we go through the review, and at the end, what you can see is a policy. Every policy that's in the comprehensive plan, we looked at to determine whether it was still relevant. And so that review, April 1, 2023, we met the deadline, and the city then has to send to the state a letter called the EAR notification letter. And that letter says whether the city must make changes based on changes in state law or not. The city did have a few changes that it had to make, so the city sent the letter to the state saying, yes, there's some changes we need to make with our comp plan. Those changes are due to the state 1 year later, April 1, 2024, which is about 3.5 weeks from now. So in the interim, the city engaged in, I'll tell you first, just show you the timeline for completion. So when Mr. Figan said we started this over a year ago, that was very accurate. We started looking at the year May of 2022 to meet that April 1 deadline of 2023. So April 1, 2023, we developed the EAR report. Following that is when we started looking at the amendments to the comprehensive plan that were needed. And now we're at the transmittal hearing and state review. So our next step here is to bring the proposed amendments to City Council tomorrow night. And if the City Council agrees, we transmit those to the state. The state then takes those and does a review, after which that will come back to City Council for an adoption hearing. So that's the timeline. And again, thank you for being here, because public comment has been really important to this process throughout. So throughout the EAR development and the review, lots of public comment, because understanding what the city's changes are and what we should pay attention to have been really important to the process. So just another timeline check-in. We've got this public meeting tonight. We also had a drop-in sessions earlier today, which is just a chance for individual one-on-one comments or questions. We'll have drop-in sessions tomorrow before the council meeting. Tomorrow night, we'll have the council meeting. That's the transmittal. And then I mentioned sort of the state review. There's two portions to the state review. One portion is the state required amendments go through a 60-day review at the state level. Anything that's not required by the state, we're calling an optional amendment, and that goes through a 30-day review. So the review standard is a bit higher for anything that's required by the state. After which point we'll align both, and then we'll do the city council adoption hearing for both the state required and the optional. So I know it's a lot of requirements and timelines and things to kind of keep, but we'll be here in case there's questions about the timeline or what's required when. So one thing I want to talk about a little bit is the findings from that year that we did in 2023. So in that document, what you'll find if you go back, and it's on the city's website, is we developed, I said we went through every policy, goal, objective policy in the city's plan, and we developed 3 sets of comments. The first was no comment. And we defined that by saying this goal, objective, or policy was sufficient to meet the city's goals, what we knew about the city's goals and the changes. Then the second column was anything that was state required that the city look at. That didn't mean that we made an amendment based on that box. It just meant that it was something that the city needs to look at to determine whether it needs to make an amendment or not. And then the optional amendments. So in that optional bucket, there was a lot of goals, objectives, and policies that could be amended, that might, if amended, be advantageous to the city. So it was very broad, and it was not a deep dive into what the amendment should be or whether it was going to be amended, just a general look to say the city might want to consider amending this goal, objective, or policy. So after that point, after the EIR report, the city wanted to work on these amendments. And again, it was a pretty limited scope. So the first part of the scope was to consider state required amendments. And the second part of the scope was to look at the optional amendments, but really in a limited kind of fashion. And limited and really mostly focused on what would bring the comprehensive plan up to date and what could be done to clean it up, and really look at anything that was just a really significant higher priority goals. So the important piece in talking about sort of that amended review, again, there's many things that could be done. There's many big questions still in the city that we've heard about that would take a considerable amount of time and in-depth study to really carefully consider. So this part of the process, because it was pretty limited, the first attempt here is to just get the plan cleaned up. And I'll talk about what that meant. Are you still with me? We're doing okay? Okay. So I want to turn to the state required amendments first, and then talk about our thinking with the state required amendments. And then I'll turn to some of the thinking around the optional amendments. So one of the things that the state did in that 7-year time frame that we were required to look at, they had 2 pieces of legislation that the city needed to address. One was requirements around solar facilities, and the second was around floating solar facilities. The first question we got was, what's floating solar? Well, floating solar is a solar facility that floats. And because, right, it's a very good question. We found some good examples. These are 2 pictures of floating solar facilities that do exist. One's in Florida. I think the other is a photo from North Carolina. So So the state said with solar that in any agricultural future land use category that the city had to allow the production of solar facilities. Remember the map that I showed you that had the future land use categories on it? So that's what the state's talking about, is any future land use category that was agriculture, the city needed to allow solar facilities. So our analysis, we worked with staff. There are no agricultural future land use categories in the city. So that exercise took a little thinking, though, because yes, you have agricultural uses in your future land use categories, but they're not agricultural in nature. So the Bonita Springs is an urbanized area. So that portion, we did not make any amendments related to solar facilities. The second thing the state did, I believe it was a year later, said floating solar facilities need to be allowed in appropriate future land use categories. I showed you a list. There's a good number of future land use categories in the city. So the challenge for the city and the analysis and the staff, we did a lot of thinking about this, which is what's appropriate and how do you define what's appropriate. So that was an important step in responding to the state legislature and to this statute about floating solar. So the first thing we did is looked at what's the size requirement for floating solar. Usually it's about a 2-acre array. So the picture that you see here at the bottom of Duke Energy's pilot project, that's 2 acres of solar. That's also on a pond, and I'm taking this from memory. It's also in a packet if you want to read more. It's a 1,200 acre pond. So it's a very large body of water, and that 2-acre array is a small portion of that. So 2 acres is about the minimum that you need for a floating solar facility to be economically feasible. And then we also looked at what are the environmental considerations or what are the other considerations around floating solar that we know of. And based on the research, it's still fairly new. So floating solar is not older technology. It's a fairly new technology where they're just starting to do research. So some of the research comes from other areas of the world. And what they're finding is there are some advantages to floating solar, water cooling, but some of the disadvantages may be some environmental considerations. For example, those panels have to be anchored to the bottom of the water body. It also can have some leaching of heavy metals, possibly, and there can be some disruption to wildlife and also sunlight blocking. Now, in a very large body of water, it's not clear how significant that is, but all of the research said that we need more research to better understand the facilities. So the conclusion of that work is that in the city, the proposed amendments are that there isn't really an appropriate future land use category for floating solar by right. And what that means is on its own, that in those future land use categories, there's not an inherent right to put in floating solar. However, there's a special exception process with the city and a plan development process with the city where if a landowner wanted to come in and propose solar or floating solar, there are provisions that the city could look at that use and look at it for character, compatibility, and all of the other environmental considerations that may arise. So the upshot of all of this is that there were no amendments made to the comprehensive plan based on floating solar or solar for state required. But that analysis does take some thinking about what's appropriate for the city. And then in the state required update, there's a few name changes, some authorities that are now going to review some of the sewer provisions that change. So there was a few other changes, relatively inconsequential. But those are in a packet, and you're welcome to view what those are. So let's turn to the optional amendments, and then I'm close to wrapping up. I know it's been a kind of a lot of dense information. So again, with optional amendments, a pretty fairly limited scope in terms of what we looked at for optional. It's important to get the comprehensive plan up to date in many of these areas, because when you read the comprehensive plan, if it's referring to a document that no longer exists, the reader doesn't know what document the city's referring to. So it's really important that all of those things that have changed be brought up to date. These don't rise to the level of state required. State required's only focused on what changed in state statute. So they don't rise to that level. So under 1, the first kind of broader sort of cleanup around the comprehensive plan were anything that was inconsistent between in the plan, whether it was between those elements or whether it was between the city and another plan. We looked at those inconsistencies. Looked at goals, objectives, and policies that are no longer consistent with the city's practice. So when the city first formed 20 plus years ago, there was certain ideas about how things would be implemented. Those have changed. And so the city's taken new direction. So policies were amended. And then there was another set of policies around, or another bucket of changes around completed actions from the city. So, for example, one of the policies said the city will support a library close to its downtown. That's not verbatim. That's from memory. So the city has done that, and there is a library. That's the kind of completed actions that we worked on. And then any outdated information or titles. Like I said, when you read the plan, if it's referring to an older process or document, it does take some digging to understand what document that the original authors were talking about. And so we worked together to find out sort of what is the document, what's the name of the document, etc. So all of those are recommended amendments. And then the second was any higher priority goals, objectives, or policies that would accomplish the city's goals. And so there was for those of you may have attended the first public meeting, there was a question about transportation and transportation impacts. There appear to be some transportation impacts from outside the city. And so looking at the transportation element, is there some tools that the city has to help alleviate transportation in the city? So that was kind of one of the higher priority goals. And then the last thing that was important to do is a rewrite of the public participation procedures. Up here it's called element, but formally the title of that section is called public participation procedures. We rewrote those procedures because they were pretty confusing to read. They referred to a lot of outdated information. And so we provided an analysis about where some of those components of those procedures should appear in a new rewrite. So you can look through that, and you should be able to see some relevance between the old amendment and the new one. The new one it's much more clear in terms of what procedures the city has to follow for public meetings like this. But one last thing I'll just note is that there were no changes to density, no changes to height restriction, no changes to the uses on the future land use categories or map. So these were a lot of cleanup work, but these are important things to many residents. So we wanted to assure the public and everyone that we were not looking at any of those changes for this cycle. So what we'd like to do is just stick around for any comments or questions. We have Dr. Green's going to be taking some notes over here on the anything optional amendments, any comments you may want to provide. And Victoria will take comments here on the state required amendments. I'll be here floating. I think we don't have a lot of people, so we'll be able to cluster around the tables. And we also have copies of the amendments if you want to flip through and see some examples. So anything that we deleted is strike through red. Anything that's added is underlined. So you should be able to quickly see some of the examples of what I'm talking about. And if you have any specific questions about some of the choices that were made, happy to do that. What time do I have? 6:05. So we'll stick around, do public, input, individual discussions till about 6:40 or so, and then if we need more time, we can stick around and talk some more. Other than that, I'll just close the session and we can answer any broad questions that everybody has at that point. Fair enough? Okay, I know I laid a lot on you. It was quite a mouthful. Okay? All right. So we'll hold that for the last. And I invite you to take, we've got the packets separated. We'll put the optional packets here. They're much thicker. State required over there. Good? All right, everybody. Yes. Well, thank you so much for coming. What I wanted to do is just provide you with some of just a reminder about what's next. And so tomorrow there'll be more drop-in sessions. And again, if you have any specific questions or things that you want me to go over, happy to do that. I'll be from 3 to 4:30 here. And then at 5:30 is the city council meeting. And so if you have specific comments that you want to put on, we will take note. I guess we didn't get many on the flip chart, but maybe we have some comments in the back. These will all be incorporated, but formal public comments you can make tomorrow at the council meeting. So please feel free to show up. And Arlene, do you want to add anything about?
You can email as well to the city clerk as well. If they have other.
So there was a 2 p.m. deadline, but is that?
So for the city council meeting, if there's still public comment, they can email the city clerk as well. If there's something that you have a question about or concern or want to get on the record this evening, you can still email the city clerk.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Arlene, for keeping me honest. So is there any questions anybody wants to ask before we wrap up that we didn't cover, or any comments that you want to make to the general?
We're going to vote on sending this to the state tomorrow?
Yes. So again, tomorrow it'll be transmitted to the state. State will make their comments 30 and 60 days. Then it will come back to council. We're estimating sometime in May or June it will come back to council for adoption. And again, we don't know the exact time frame. Council has 180 days to do the adoption after it gets comments back from the state. So more than likely it'll be within a shorter time frame. Good question. So the state will provide what they call, they don't exercise this option. It's called an ORC report. What's the O? Orders, recommendations, and comments. Yes. They generally don't provide orders, and they may come back with comments. And so some of those comments may be on things that the council will have to decide what to do with those. So I'll give you an example. The Florida Department of Transportation will also review under this process. And if Florida Department of Transportation comes back and says, you got this part wrong, or there's some new plans out here that you didn't consider, etc., something of that nature, then we'll make some recommended changes and council would potentially adopt those. It does not go back through the whole entire process, correct? Right, yeah. So there's likely some limited changes that will happen upon adoption. That's a normal part of the process. Maybe some information hasn't come in yet, but it does not have to go back through. Yeah. And again, the state required is more prescriptive than the optional. So the optional amendments go through expedited review, and so the level of scrutiny is not quite as high as the state required. All very important amendments, but different review process.
I have just a question. Is the city mandated to come back with whatever the state says or does not say? Is the city mandated in a time frame to come back with a final approval?
Yes, sir. So we'll take the 60-day review. So after the 60-day review, if the state sends back the comments, then council has 180 days for the adoption. So there is a time frame. Very good. Thank you.
Please come with your comments tomorrow night. I want to hear what you have to say.
Or email your comments and come. Or write comments in the back and email. And come. All right. Very good. Wonderful to meet everyone. Thank you. All right.
Is